One question, two views. You decide.
Welcome to You Decide. A lot of channels out there will tell you exactly what to think. We're not going to do that. Here, we do things a little differently. Our job is pretty simple. We lay out the strongest arguments we can find on both sides of a tough question. And then, well, the rest is up to you. You decide for yourself. All right, so this explainer is part of our deep dive into the Easter island Moai. And this season, we are obsessed with one central mystery. Could these giant stone statues, these Moai, have actually been walked upright all the way from the quarry to where they stand today? Now, when it comes to this question, you've basically got two main camps. First, there's the walking view. The idea here is that the statues were moved upright, sort of waddled side to side with ropes, like you'd move a refrigerator. Then you've got the sledge view, which argues, no way, they were laid down flat and dragged horizontally on big wooden sledges or maybe even rollers. Every explainer we're doing this season looks at a different piece of this puzzle. Okay, so for this one, let's really get into the forensic evidence. We're going to focus on a really specific question. The Moai that we find fallen down along the ancient roads. What do their locations and their conditions tell us? Does this evidence point to one transport method over the other? And right away, the two sides see this evidence completely differently. The walking view says it's obvious. These are transport failures. They're statues that fell down mid-journey. But the sledge view? They argue these statues were intentionally placed right where they are, and that they fell or broke much, much later for totally different reasons. So, to get to the bottom of this, we're going to break it down into three key areas. First, we'll look at the distribution of the statues, then the damage patterns on them, and finally, we'll ask if their placement was an accident or on purpose. All right, let's jump into that first big question, statue distribution. Is the pattern we see a story of spectacular failures, or is it actually a map of an ancient culture? So the walking view looks at where these fallen Moai are located and says, aha, this is a totally predictable pattern of mechanical failure. But the sledge view looks at that exact same map and says, nope, this isn't about physics, it's about people. It's just a reflection of human geography, where people lived, worked, and worshipped. So let's look at the key piece of data for the walking view. It's a pretty startling number. Over half, 51.6% to be exact, of all the Moai found along the ancient roads are clustered within just 2 kilometers of the main quarry where they were all carved. And proponents of the walking view say, look, that is not a coincidence. They say it's a classic pattern called exponential decay. It perfectly matches engineering models for mechanical risk. Think about it. Failure is most likely right at the beginning of a big project, right? The statue is at its heaviest, the terrain right outside the quarry is steep, and the moving crew, well, they haven't quite found their rhythm yet. So the statues that fell, they just didn't get very far. But hold on, the sledge view comes back with a totally different take. They say this cluster isn't about physics, it's about people. Where were the early settlements? Well, they were concentrated right near the quarry, which was also close to the island's best freshwater sources. So of course you're going to find more statues there. It's where the people were. They argue these kinds of exponential decay patterns show up all the time in human geography and don't prove anything about transport failure. Okay. So that's the where. Let's move on to our second big argument, the how. We're talking about damage. When we look at these broken statues, are we looking at the aftermath of a sudden, catastrophic collapse, or the slow, gradual process of settling over hundreds of years? Again, two totally different interpretations. The walking view zooms in on what looks like evidence of an upright collapse. We're talking major fractures on the statue's faces and fronts. But the sledge view points to something else entirely, signs of slow, gradual settling, and even evidence that the ancient Rapa Nui people tried to prop them up with supporting stones. So, from the walking view perspective, the crime scene, so to speak, is pretty clear. The statues are often found face down, toppled forward. And the damage? It's concentrated right on their faces and the front of their bodies. They argue this is a smoking gun. It's exactly what would happen if a multi-ton statue, waddling along, lost its balance, and just face-planted. Critically, they say, there are no big drag marks on their backs, which you'd expect if they were being slid horizontally. But the sledge view, they look at the very same statues and see a completely different story. They'll point out that many of these fractures aren't clean, catastrophic breaks. They're more like cracks, where the broken pieces are still right there, just settled in place. and they find these so-called chalking stones carefully placed around the base, almost like someone was trying to shore them up. To them, this doesn't look like an accident. It looks like a monument that's settled over time, with people trying to maintain it. And this leads us right into our third and final argument, which really gets to the heart of the whole debate. Were these road Moai abandoned failures, or were they intentional monuments right where they were supposed to be? So here's the bottom line for this section. The walking view sees these statues as failures, frozen in time at the exact moment of their catastrophic fall. The Sledge view, on the other hand, sees them as deliberate, important monuments that were part of a huge, sacred landscape that lined the island's ancient roads. For the walking view, context is absolutely everything. These fallen Moai aren't just anywhere. They're found along known transport routes, and often they're right at a point where the slope changes, going from flat to uphill or uphill to downhill. That is exactly the kind of tricky spot where a walking motion could go wrong. And once one of these behemoths fell over, game over. There was no way to get it back up and walking, so it stayed there, a permanent marker of a bad day at work. But the Sledge view counters with what they've found by digging around these statues. They've uncovered things like stone pavements and ceremonial pits right at the sites. And they point to weathering patterns that suggest these Moai stood upright in that spot for a very, very long time. You combine that physical evidence with local oral traditions that actually give names to many of these specific road Moai, and it starts to sound less like an abandoned accident and more like a revered, named landmark. So there you have it. We've walked through the three main lines of evidence. And now, as always, it's your turn to decide. We started by asking, is the locations and conditions of fallen Moai point to a specific transport method? We looked at the statue distribution. Was it a pattern of failure or a map of culture? We examined the damage. Was it from a sudden collapse or slow settling? And finally, we questioned their placement. Were they abandoned accidents or intentional monuments? So it really boils down to this. The walking view argues that all the patterns we see, the distribution, the damage, the location, are best explained as the result of mechanical failures during upright transport. The Sledge view, however, says those same patterns are better explained by conscious human choices, things like settlement patterns, ritual practices, and how these monuments interacted with the environment over centuries. We've laid out both sides as fairly as we can. And remember, this channel does not take a position. So, the question goes to you. What's your take? Which argument do you find more compelling? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And hey, if there's another mystery you want us to tackle, tell us about it.